You're waiting inside the ranks. The war has been going on for a long time. Suddenly, everything changes. The soldiers beside you begin to fall one by one. The attack isn't coming from just one direction. From the flanks, from behind. They're closing in on you from all sides. The space around you is closing in. The enemy is getting closer and closer. For most people, this moment is the beginning of the end. Panic sets in, some try to flee. But for Roman soldiers, the situation was different. They were trained for moments like this. Still, in the end, they were human too. So how did they react when surrounded? In the midst of battle, how were they able to keep going without panicking? If you're ready, let's find out the answers to these questions together. To understand how Roman soldiers responded to encirclement, you first need to understand what encirclement actually meant in the context of ancient battle. Modern military thinking about being surrounded carries specific connotations: cut supply lines, no escape route, eventual attrition. Ancient encirclement was different and more immediately lethal. A formation surrounded in ancient battle faced attack from multiple directions simultaneously, with no physical barrier between itself and the attacking force. The defensive geometry of the ancient formation, which assumed a front and flanks, but relied on the rear being protected by the rear ranks, collapsed when enemies were also attacking from behind. The Roman formation's standard defensive structure was the scutum shield wall. Every soldier covered himself and his right hand neighbor. This system worked with extraordinary efficiency along a line facing one direction. When the line became a circle, the geometry changed completely. There was no longer a front and a rear. There was only the perimeter, and every point of the perimeter needed to be simultaneously defended. Roman training addressed this specific problem with a specific solution: the Orbis, the circular formation. The Orbis was not improvised under pressure. It was drilled as a formation transition, practiced until it could be executed from a signal in the same way that the column to line transition was practiced. The entire century cohort or legion could reorganize from a marching column or a battle line into a defensive circle while under pressure, provided the training had made the movement automatic. The Orbis had real defensive capability. A circle presents every side as a defended front. The shields of the men on each section of the perimeter covered that section against the enemy attacking from that direction. The formation was not static. It could move as a unit, contracting to keep the perimeter dense or expanding to push outward. An enemy who had surrounded a Roman force and expected panic instead encountered a reorganized defensive structure that required coordinated assault from all sides simultaneously to break, which was extremely difficult to achieve in the chaos of ancient battle. The psychological purpose of the Orbis was as important as its tactical function. A formation that reorganized, rather than disintegrated, was a formation whose members had reason to believe they might survive. The act of reorganization itself, the visible evidence that the century was still functioning as a unit, rather than as a collection of individually panicking men, was the first step in managing the terror of encirclement. The most famous Roman defensive formation, the Testudo or tortas, was not primarily designed for the open field encirclement that the Orbis addressed. It was designed for a specific and extremely dangerous situation, advancing under missile fire, particularly during siege operations where defenders on walls could pour projectiles down onto the attacking formation from above and all sides. The Testudo required every soldier to lock his shield with his neighbor's. The men in the outer ranks held their shields facing outward. The men in the interior raised their shields overhead to form the roof. The result was a box of shields with no external surface exposed, capable of advancing under sustained missile fire without individual soldiers being hit. The logistical requirements of the Testudo were considerable. The shields had to be the right size and shape. The scutum's rectangular curved surface, specifically designed to interlock at the edges. The soldiers had to be at exactly the right spacing. The formation had to move at a pace that maintained the shield lock. Any gap in the shield wall, any moment of imperfect interlocking, created a vulnerability that could be exploited by well-aimed projectiles. Ancient sources describe the Testudo with a specific combination of admiration and practicality. Cassius Dio records that during Trajan's Dacian campaigns, the Testudo was so well executed that soldiers could walk across it as if on a floor. This is probably an exaggeration, but the underlying truth is that a well-executed Testudo was genuinely impressive as a feat of collective coordination, and that its execution required a level of training and trust between the men forming it that only sustained service together could produce. The psychological effect of the Testudo on its users was as important as its physical protection. Inside a well-formed Testudo, the individual soldier was surrounded on all sides by shields and by his comrades. He could not see much of the outside. He could hear the impacts of missiles on the shields above him. He was receiving protection from the men around him and providing protection to them. The formation converted individual vulnerability into collective defense in a way that was physically real and psychologically powerful. The same training that produced the formation also produced the ability to function within it under fire. The tactical formations addressed the physical problem of being surrounded. The psychological problem was separate and required different responses. Encirclement in ancient battle triggered a specific terror that was qualitatively different from the fear of frontal combat. In frontal combat, the enemy was in front of you. You could see him, assess him, orient your shield toward him. The men beside you and behind you were your protection, and you were theirs. The geometry of the threat was known, and the defensive response was trained. In encirclement, the threat came from everywhere. Every direction was potentially the direction of the next attack. The instinct to turn and face the threat, the fundamental human response to danger, became a source of confusion rather than a survival mechanism, because turning to face one threat meant turning your back to another. The psychological demand of maintaining defensive orientation in all directions simultaneously was beyond the training of most ancient soldiers. Roman soldiers were not exempt from this terror. What they had that most ancient soldiers did not was a trained response to it. The Orbis was not just a formation. It was a procedure for converting unmanageable fear into manageable tasks. The soldier who was reorganizing into the Orbis was doing something specific, something trained, something that had a clear end point. He was not just surviving. He was executing a procedure. And executing a procedure, even under extreme fear, is psychologically less damaging than having nothing to do but be afraid. The centurion's role in encirclement was the most critical it ever became. In a normal battle, the centurion managed his century from a position that gave him visibility over the front rank. In encirclement, there was no front. The centurion, who maintained his authority, who continued giving clear commands, who did not show the fear that every man around him was feeling, was the anchor that kept the unit from dissolving. Ancient sources consistently identify centurion behavior as the decisive variable in whether surrounded units held or broke. Polybius and Livy both describe situations where Roman units, surrounded and apparently doomed, held together because their officers maintained command function. The men around an officer, who was still giving clear orders, had something to respond to other than their own fear. The training that made soldiers respond automatically to commands created a feedback loop in crisis. The commands came, the soldiers responded, the response produced the formation produced a survival structure, and the survival structure gave the soldiers reason to believe they might actually survive. The most extraordinary example of a Roman army dealing with encirclement is also one where the Romans were simultaneously the surrounded and the surrounding force, and their response is documented in more detail than almost any other ancient military operation. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar besieged the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix at the hilltop fortress of Alesia in central Gaul. Caesar's army of approximately 60,000 men surrounded Alesia's garrison of perhaps 80,000 Gallic warriors, building a circumvallation, an inner ring of fortifications facing the fortress to contain the defenders. What Caesar did not fully anticipate was the speed with which a Gallic relief army assembled. Within weeks, a relief force estimated by Caesar himself at 250,000 warriors arrived outside his position. Caesar's army was now surrounded. Vercingetorix's garrison inside Alesia, the Roman circumvallation facing inward toward the fortress, the Roman contravallation facing outward toward the relief army, and beyond that the Gallic relief force in its full strength. Caesar's response to this situation was to build both rings simultaneously and to hold them both. His soldiers dug and built at a pace that ancient sources found remarkable, constructing the full contravallation while simultaneously maintaining the circumvallation and fighting off probing attacks from both sides. The engineering capability we discussed in an earlier video was deployed at maximum intensity precisely because the tactical situation demanded it. The decisive moments at Alesia came when the relief army and the garrison coordinated simultaneous attacks on different sections of the Roman fortifications. Caesar personally moved between threatened sectors, his red cloak making him visible to his soldiers, deliberately using his visibility as a command tool to rally men at the points of maximum pressure. Alesia did not fall to the Gauls because the Roman fortifications held, because the Roman supply system had positioned sufficient food to sustain the siege through the Gallic attacks, and because the Roman soldiers maintained their formation discipline under simultaneous pressure from two directions. The encirclement that should have destroyed Caesar's army instead became the context for one of the most complete Roman military victories in the entire record. The honest account of Roman encirclement cannot consist only of successful responses. The formations failed. The psychology broke. Men who were trained to hold the Orbis fled anyway. Understanding when and why this happened is as important as understanding when and why it did not. Cannae remains the most studied example of Roman formation failure under encirclement. The Carthaginian encirclement at Cannae was so complete, and the compression of the Roman formation so extreme, that the Orbis could not be formed. The Romans were packed too tightly together to execute any formation change. Men who tried to raise their shields to form the Orbis found themselves pressed against the men behind them. By the pressure of the compressed formation, the tactical response that training had provided was rendered unavailable by the physical conditions of the encirclement. This reveals an important limitation of the trained formation response. It required space to execute. An encirclement that compressed a formation faster than the formation could reorganize negated the training advantage. Hannibal understood this. The Cannae encirclement was designed specifically to prevent reorganization by making the compression faster than the Roman response. The Teutoburg forest presented a different failure mode. The German ambush destroyed the Roman formations not through encirclement in the open field sense, but through the disruption of the terrain itself. Forest fighting broke the formation before the encirclement could be completed, because the Roman combat system depended on the ability to maintain formation geometry, and forest terrain made formation geometry impossible. The trees were closer together than the Roman scutum shields were wide. Both failures share a common element: the tactical response that training had prepared for was made unavailable by the specific conditions of the engagement. This was not a failure of Roman training. It was a failure of Roman intelligence and operational planning. The commanders who led their armies into Cannae and Teutoburg had allowed their forces to enter conditions where their trained responses could not function. The soldiers who died there were not less capable than the soldiers who survived elsewhere. They were placed in conditions where capability was irrelevant. One of the moments soldiers feared most was being surrounded when they least expected it. In such a situation, there would be nowhere to run. The Roman army, however, left nothing to chance. Thanks to the training they had received beforehand, they knew exactly what to do in that moment, where to stand, how to move, and most importantly, not to panic. When surrounded, they had to act as a unit, not make individual decisions, even if human nature urged them to flee. The discipline they had learned kept them together. Of course, they weren't always successful. At Cana, at Teutoburg, sometimes even this system proved insufficient. But what set Rome apart was this. Instead of fleeing defeat, they chose to learn from it. Fighting alone wasn't enough. What truly mattered was knowing how to fight under any conditions. Perhaps that was exactly what kept Rome standing. What do you think would be the hardest thing for a soldier in the heat of battle? Is it harder to flee when surrounded, or to stay put and remain calm